On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Anil Choudary. He is the CTO at Alliant Credit Union. We're going to be talking about technology and business engagement. And within that, we're going to be talking about tech debt. We're going to be talking about that relationship to the business, their understanding. Obviously, a lot of times projects that have to be done can't just be done because there's a business need. We have some issues within that tech debt conversation that need to be addressed to take a step forward. And we're going to be talking about all that with Anil. Thanks for joining the show. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here, Amir, and thank you for inviting me.
All right. So, I think when we first talked about this, I thought it was a really fascinating connection. And I've been talking to other leaders about this concept of tech debt. And the more I keep talking about it, the more I realize there are some nuances in here that, we should explore further. This episode, we're going to talk about technology and business engagement. And maybe my first question, and maybe this is where I'd like to kind of start is whether you're at a credit union, you're at another enterprise, you're a software company, you are a part of the business, you're trying to execute however way we now look at it, right? Your product might be different, but we're all doing the same thing. When you look at that business engagement and the business needs and the business priorities from a business user, and this, I guess you're a CTO, you have a seat at the table. From a business perspective, if you were to take the technology hat off, you understand what the business wants. There's no doubt. You know what the business wants. And when that technology hat is off, talk to me about how you process that business priority and that business initiative, and how do you keep that technology hat from being put on your head too soon? Or is it always on? Is that technology hat hard to turn off?
It is always on in the sense of you need to account for how things get done and delivered ultimately, right? So that is the constant continuous thinking that you have to maintain. But then you also have the need or accountability to fully understand what the business is thinking. What is the definition of product for them? How does it impact the top line and bottom line? And then how is it going to serve our members in the credit union space or customers in a general sense? So being able to really understand how they are thinking about the product, how it is going to deliver an outcome, what is the value chain for that is going to be very, very important. And then being able to then translate that into something that the technologist can fully understand, I think is part of the next step. But at the front of it, it's basically understanding what we are in the business of, what the business is trying to implement as a product, and how does that product interact with the customer or member, and then how does it interact with the business internally. So once you get that, then you go about solving from a technology perspective.
It's interesting. I never held the role of CTO, but obviously most technologists, when they're sitting in a meeting, have gone through the process of, as they're hearing the business requirements, we all start thinking about that solution, right? We start thinking about how we break it out. Here's how I do it, because I think it's natural. I think a chef probably, if they're catering an event, starts thinking, "Oh, how am I going to do the back end?" And I think it's a very natural thing. And I think it's interesting because as we're sitting down and we're looking at the business priorities and we're kind of focusing on how to deliver for business, we know where the dead bodies are buried, where the skeletons are, what the challenges have been. Business might not actually care, right? The business, the priorities, the product managers, they might not really care. Hey, this has been the challenges. And there are obstacles, right? I'm not going to say we can't overcome them to do what we want. And we refer to those as tech debt. We say, hey, there's tech debt, there's debt we need to pay. If not, there's challenges, or there's, you're going to add to it. When you, as a leader, are working with the rest of the C-suite, with other business stakeholders, and this issue comes up of, well, we really want this. And in the back of your head, you just went through and you rationalized, oh man, this is not an easy, straightforward thing. It will take us time. We have issues. How is that communicated? How do you have that conversation so that it doesn't sound like an excuse?
Totally, Amir. This is a classic use case I'm sure every technology leader, every technologist deals with in their own way. I can relate to, I'll try and abstract out the technology component of it, or say it in a way that is more generic. Every organization has a system that is the at the center of the organization that kind of enables the organization. Say for a manufacturing organization, that's an ERP. For a financial services, it's core banking, right? So if you think about it that way, a lot of times, or unless you're a startup where you're making good solid decisions and then building on top of it, you always have this legacy stack that you're dealing with. And the older that legacy stack is, the more that got customized and more got built around it to meet the business needs. And the more that you carry forward, that becomes technical debt in a way, because the more you put around that ERP solution or core banking solution, that becomes more of a maintenance. So what I have done in our particular case is bring that to the executive team in a way that they fully understood how it all evolved over a 20-year period. Hey, we started here. We as an organization matured over the last 20 years. And as we matured, we learned, but also built a lot of these ancillary solutions on top of the core. And now we need to move in a nimble way. And for us to move fast, we need to do a lot of this unwinding of what we built. And that is a way of giving them, hey, this is not necessarily a technology problem. This is an enterprise problem. This is all our problem, because we as a business evolved over the last 20 years. We built all these solutions, and giving them that sense of the complexity and how the business and technology interact in that model is the first step. Not that that is going to deliver the outcome that you want, but it is the step one to be able to disambiguate that for your audience. And that gets them into a conversation. And then you build on top of that. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. I think it does make sense. And I think, I think sometimes when we're talking about tech debt, I think the term gets used a lot, obviously, on the engineering side. We understand what that means. I think what you just described, that business side, that understanding, it's interesting because, they might not really care of the limitations, because they don't know that 6 years ago somebody made a decision that altered what they can do now. And I think that's interesting because the organization also does know that if they, 7 years ago somebody went and spent $20 million to do something, it would potentially impact the ability to acquire credit and do something now. So I think they understand it. I think sometimes we look at it and it's very difficult. What should take 2 weeks, we tell them, well, it's going to take us 2 years. I mean, we're not going to have to, we have to go unwind and do all this stuff. And that priority of what that business engagement is different. I guess when you're looking from the C-level and you're having these conversations, when you start looking at emerging technologies, and I'm not going to make this a GenAI conversation because who knows next year this time what we have, but just in general, when we're talking about technologies that are showing up and opportunities to expand what the capabilities are, sometimes you do have to deal with this notion of tech debt. And you have to go back to the business and kind of say, hey, it's 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward to take advantage of these. And the investment needed does have to potentially remedy the past. When you're having that conversation, it's a big picture conversation, maybe a small win up front. As a leader, how does that look from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, again, a very classic question in terms of any tech leader is dealing with, right? So it's never an easy, seamless conversation with the business leaders on these, right? So you touched on GenAI, and maybe I'll go back to that for a few seconds. Any tech leader would be lying if they said they did not get the pressure from the executive team or the board on what are we doing about GenAI, right? So if we think about it that way, think what we did in our organization is really brought all of our executive team together and said, what is your understanding of GenAI? What do you think are relevant use cases as per your understanding of business? We hashed all of those use cases and we put them on a 2x2 matrix of feasibility and value. And we ultimately got to maybe 2 of the 30 use cases that were GenAI. So that kind of one helped elevate the understanding of our audience in terms of what is GenAI versus not, but then also give them a clear sense of here is where the latest and greatest technology is really applicable for us. All the other use cases are essentially use cases that can be solved by regular AI, ML, data analytics and stuff, so on and so forth. So now bringing it back to your broader question, it's always about being able to tie it to education. I think is super important. Being able to go to the audience in terms of what is their level of understanding, how are they projecting their thinking in terms of the problem. Once you get to that point, it becomes a lot more easier. So that's where I'll also touch on a larger topic, maybe a more complicated one, which is the culture. Culture of the organization definitely plays into this, because if the audience, in this case business, they're following a culture of, hey, here is the thing that I need technology to do, and that's all I care about, it becomes very difficult to have a meaningful conversation. Versus if there is a culture, a product mindset, and the business leaders are willing to understand the end-to-end value chain and where we are from a current state perspective, what are the barriers for us to move in an agile, fast way, then the conversations become a bit more managed, much more easier to deliver.
You touched on culture. I had a conversation, and I'm curious about your perspective, because the conversation was about empowering engineers. And there was a conversation around companies are dynamic in how they view technology. At one point, they might be behind, trailing. One time, that might be leading. Most of the time, they're in the middle. Whatever it is, and we use example of Walmart, for example. At one point, Walmart was an innovator. For a long time, they were less innovating, and now all of a sudden they're full back in. I mean, they have their app is crazy, it does really amazing things. We could pick other companies too. When you think about empowering engineers, and I don't mean that you empower an engineer because they're smart and they do this, but also you empower them because technology solutions, when brought from engineering perspective, has a different value in an organization, right? They see gaps as they're implementing. When you talk about culture and fostering empowering of engineering, maybe from your experience, how do those two work hand in hand?
Again, fantastic question, and very relevant to something we did very recently within our organization, right? So hackathons, right? So are a great opportunity for you to increase that engagement within the engineering teams, for them to do more of a bottoms up, their understanding of the organization. A lot of times in organizations, it's like businesses proposing a product, a solution, or a product, and then you go build it. And the engineering teams are almost all the time on the delivery side of it. Versus when you do things like hackathons, you are empowering your engineering teams to think more broadly. How would they solve the problems that they are seeing bottom up, versus getting those requirements top down? And that was a huge success for us, in the sense that there were about 8 different use cases that came about. Within that half day, there were solutions that were built, semi-built, and the value that was clearly shown was massive. And now we kind of identified top 3 winners, and we are going to actually implement and showcase in our all hands. So all of that is clearly showing the innovation side of the organization, but also the engineering teams are getting their voice heard, and that is getting recognized not only from a deliverable perspective, but also the value that the business sees. And that overall increases the trust and culturally elevates the organization, because now the business has a newfound understanding of, hey, my technology teams, my engineers are also thinking about, they also better understand what my problem sets are. So I think it goes both ways. One, elevating the engineering organization, but also bridging the divide between business and technology.
Interesting. I know we're talking about technology and business engagement, tech debt. Obviously, this is a little bit not within the tech debt. Talking a little bit more about that business engagement now. I guess maybe what I took away from that, and again, piggybacking off this other conversation, was should engineers shift left? Because if you have one hackathon and you guys are showcasing it as a good result, would more hackathons? I mean, this is like I'm going to ask you a question. It might be simple, stupid. And you're like, hey, Amir, it doesn't work. More hackathons means more innovation? Or is it a case of, listen, that's just not how this can work, because we can't have engineers go building freelance projects constantly. And I think what's interesting is because this person has a background working for, let's say, Meta, and that's what they encourage, right? And I think you're talking about hackathon, which is allowing your team to deliver something that they're capable of. And I think the interesting discussion was, engineers are good problem solvers. They might not have enough time to actually go tackle these other problems. So for you, the hackathon was like that. But I guess, the simple question would be, is more hackathons mean more innovation, or is that just not how it works?
No, I'll answer that question, but maybe before I get there, I'll say something that I recently read in a book that I've not completed, but it states that almost all organizations today can call themselves software companies, because there is no organization in the world that is not dependent on technology, that's not dependent on applications. So with that said, yes, hackathons are not the solution, but then more and more you think about it from a product perspective, which is where most of the tech, like the Metas or the Amazons of the world, they think that way, they behave that way. And the reason I juxtapose that software company mindset is because then you're organizing around the product mindset. And if you think about it from that perspective, the gap between technology and the product teams reduces. And so it's happening at a co-innovation. So the business and the product teams and the technology teams, you're eliminating or reducing that gap. So that's where the Metas and the Amazons are operating, right? So as other organizations like ours, we are not there, but I think we can emulate some of that by hackathons, and that kind of driving the lessening the divide, I would say, between the business product teams and the technology teams. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. It actually fits. I think it was interesting because we actually had a similar conversation, and I think when talking about that, and we're talking about empowering a software engineer, and we look at different businesses, right? Emulation of some of those properties, I think, are very key, because as you mentioned, you guys might not need to hire somebody who's doing research on LLMs. Might not be what your company needs, but you do need somebody to go understand and develop core competency around that, right? And I think that's where some of these initiatives, I think, are playing in terms of that model. And I think the product side you mentioned, because I don't think it really gets covered much. I don't cover it enough, and maybe I actually should have some product people on, but the product roadmap is different in terms of what an enterprise does. I'm not going to say you guys are a fantastic company, but the product team operates differently than the product team at Meta. And the forward-looking aspect of it is different, because they're thinking about innovation for users 3 to 5 years out, because they have a different competition to worry about. You guys are doing the same, but it's a different competition. It's very interesting, as you said, it's mirrored, but I do think the product teams play slightly different roles because of the business priorities. If you're looking at the product team, I know you're a CTO, but you work with product people. If you're looking at mirroring some of what you see at these other companies, what should we start seeing from, let's say, outside of the 20, 30 most innovative tech companies? What can we borrow from their product team so that you're able to kind of execute at a similar model?
Yeah, I will dumb it down a little bit and relate it to more of the middle tier. When I say middle tier, I'm not talking about the on the edge tech companies, but mainstream organizations, right? So as we think about technology and as we think about product teams, this is my personal opinion based on my experience, that there are a lot of emerging product leaders who understand product in its meaning, like what does product mean and how does that help, say, a digital bank. But being able to now translate that big idea into something translatable, implementable, that is where the gap is. Being able to really break it down into a simplistic or simplifying that the technology teams can understand and then be able to build it. I think that's the gap, in my opinion. So yes, it is completely different from a product organization or a product manager from a Meta or the other organizations. But if you think about it from the mainstream organizations, the definition of understanding is great, but then taking it to the next level of really bridging the gap between technology and product, I think that's where a lot of opportunity still exists. I think that's where resources are getting better and better. I'm talking about not the leading edge organizations, but organizations that are starting to emulate more and more of the product mindset, more and more of the agile implementing DevSecOps. DevSecOps, if you ask, every organization has its own definition, maturity, and scale. So I feel like there is a huge opportunity. There is a lot of growth from in resources in that space, but that's a huge gap that I'm seeing starting to get addressed.
Yeah, actually, I think that's fantastic. I think that's a very good option. Yeah, and 100%. I think obviously, the leading edge tech companies, they're operating differently than other companies, and it's not a fair comparison. I thought you brought a great analogy of companies at that tier and the opportunity, and I think that's the exciting part of it, right? I think that's why so many companies have looked at a GenAI and said we need to explore, because they're recognizing there's an opportunity to shift business culture capabilities, and it's like they're trying to be at the forefront. Because interestingly, you rarely ever see mainstream mainstream businesses that have technology go, you know what, bleeding edge technology, let's jump into it head first. I very, very rarely have heard that, but this is the one use case that's like, we need to at least have an understanding. So if we're going to proceed or we're going to evaluate, we need that. I think even with the cloud, people were more hesitant to go from their own networks and clouds to the public, to like an Amazon or Azure or GCP. So I think it's an interesting phenomenon we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. And I've gone through that cycle in the last year and a half, and it's a huge learning. And what I mean by that is, early on, there was a lot of push to kind of, hey, how do we create value? We jumped on the bandwagon and we quickly realized that the solutioning is not ready. The tools are not ready as you can take them on and plug and play and deliver value. So we went through that cycle over a 6-9 month period, a lot of learning, the team matured, but ultimately we delivered a robust solution that is really delivering value. And if you really look around, one of the questions that I got from a peer in the industry is, we see so many folks talking about GenAI, but very few people are actually showcasing solutions that are actually delivering value. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people, but when you double click, triple click into them and go ask them the questions, they're not necessarily production ready. And I am proud to say that we have a production ready solution which is being used and it's delivering value. So I think there is a lot more to it, but the initial hype is gone, right? So now it's about really understanding how does it fit into your organization? Does it really meet the needs of your organization? If so, yes, let's go implement it, versus let's jump on this bandwagon. That period has passed, in my opinion.
Well, I think that business engagement's interesting, because obviously, at times when they come up and ask you, what's your solution? that engagement's already there. It's a little bit easier to go and marshal resources and go experiment in this case. So it's kind of nice. That doesn't always happen. Anil, I was going to say thank you for joining. Thank you for kind of diving into this, talking about the subject. I'm sure we haven't exhausted it. If somebody wants to, reach out, continue the conversation with you, what's a good way of touching base with you?
Email, for sure, or LinkedIn, I think is the best, I would say. I'm on it most of the time and quickly respond to that. So I would highly recommend LinkedIn as the best way to reach out.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure to include your LinkedIn URL on the show notes so people can just go click on it, connect with you. Again, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you, Amir. I really enjoyed the conversation. Again, time is always short, but it was really, really nice. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. All right. That's it for the episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. I think this conversation, I know you're going to start hearing some episodes around tech debt from me. This was interesting because we were going to talk about technology and business engagement and where tech debt fits. I think we nailed the conversation. Neil was spot on with some of his examples, his observations. We talked about GenAI as well. We don't always do, but I think it was a great use case for that business engagement. And Neil's actually delivering a really cool solution, which might have to have him on in the future to kind of talk to us about that and explore that with him. So share this episode with somebody else who might find it interesting. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.